The unlikely discovery. The twin suns of the desert planet, Zilora, beat down on Ethan's dusty face as he trudged through endless dunes. His boots sank into the sand with every step, and the only sounds were the whistle of dry winds and the faint crunch of his footsteps. Ethan, a scavenger by trade, wasn't expecting much from today's journey, just another day of hunting for scrap in a barren wasteland. But then something caught his eye. In the distance, a faint glimmer sparkled under the harsh sunlight. Ethan squinted, shielding his eyes with a hand. The shine didn't look like ordinary scrap. It was too clean, too perfect. Curiosity sparked in his chest, and he changed direction, his tired legs now fueled by intrigue. As he approached, the object came into view, a sword, unlike anything he had ever seen. It was embedded in a block of glowing stone, standing upright as though waiting for someone to claim it. The blade shimmered with an otherworldly light, its surface etched with strange, shifting symbols. The stone hummed softly, resonating in a way Ethan could feel in his bones. "What is this?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He circled the sword cautiously, his scavenger instincts warning him against touching something so unusual. But the sword seemed to call to him, the symbols glowing brighter the closer he got. Against his better judgment, Ethan reached out. His fingers brushed the hilt, and a surge of warmth shot up his arm, as if the weapon recognized him. Before he could think twice, he gripped the sword and pulled. The blade slid out effortlessly, and the hum of the stone grew into a deep, resonant tone that echoed across the dunes. Ethan staggered back, holding the sword tightly. The symbols on the blade flared, bathing the area in a strange light. The air around him felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Then everything went silent. Ethan's heart pounded as he scanned the horizon. The glowing stone had gone dark, crumbling into a pile of lifeless rubble. But the sword in his hand still pulsed with energy, its symbols shifting as if trying to communicate. Ethan didn't understand what it was, but he knew one thing: it wasn't ordinary. As he turned to leave, a chill ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. Far off, barely visible against the shimmering waves of heat, a figure watched him. Tall and slender, it stood unnaturally still, its silhouette distorted by the desert air. Ethan froze, gripping the sword tighter. He didn't know who or what it was, but he felt its gaze like a weight on his chest. "Time to move," he whispered to himself. Ethan slid the sword into his pack and began walking quickly, resisting the urge to run. The weight of the weapon felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more than just physical mass. His mind raced with questions. Who had left the sword here? Why did it react to him? And who was that watching from the distance? The desert seemed endless, but Ethan pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. Every now and then, he glanced over his shoulder. The figure was gone, but the uneasy feeling remained. After what felt like hours, Ethan reached a rocky outcrop and decided to rest. He pulled out the sword, holding it up to the fading sunlight. The symbols glowed faintly now, their patterns mesmerizing. As he stared, a sharp pain shot through his head, a flash of images that weren't his own. A grand alien city, its towers stretching into the sky. An enormous throne room, where a figure clad in golden armor held the sword high. And then destruction, flames, screams, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Ethan gasped and dropped the sword. The visions vanished, leaving him shaken. He scrambled back, staring at the blade as if it might attack him. But it just lay there, motionless, its glow dimming as the sun set. "What the hell have I gotten myself into?" Ethan muttered. Before he could collect his thoughts, a deep rumble shook the ground. The sound wasn't natural. It was rhythmic, mechanical. Ethan stood, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, a dark shape emerged, a ship, sleek and predatory, descending from the sky. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He watched as the ship hovered, its underside glowing ominously. A beam of light shot out, scanning the area where the glowing stone had been. Ethan's heart sank. They were looking for the sword, and they would find him. Snapping out of his daze, Ethan grabbed the sword and bolted into the shadows of the rocky outcrop. The ship's spotlight swept across the dunes, inching closer to his hiding spot. Ethan's mind raced. Whoever was on that ship wasn't here to talk. He needed to get far away, and fast. As the light neared his position, Ethan clutched the sword tightly. Its glow returned, stronger this time, as if it sensed the danger. Ethan didn't know why, but he felt a strange sense of reassurance. The sword wanted him to survive. With no other choice, Ethan slipped deeper into the rocks, the hum of the ship growing louder above him. He had no idea what he was running from, or what he was running toward. But one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The Queen's wrath awakens. Far above the desert planet of Zalora, the Androlon mothership hovered in orbit, its sleek silver hull reflecting the distant light of stars. Within the grand control chamber, Queen Zoria stood before a towering holographic map of the galaxy. Her emerald green skin shimmered under the cold blue lights of the chamber, and her piercing yellow eyes were fixed on a pulsing red signal emanating from Zalora. The sword had been activated. Zoria's slender fingers tightened into fists as her attendants, clad in ceremonial armor, stood silently at her side. The Queen's presence was magnetic, yet terrifying. Her tall, regal frame was adorned with ornate golden armor, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with suppressed energy. The sword was no ordinary relic. It was the Blade of Vrindle, an artifact tied to the ancient power that secured her empire's dominance. It had been lost for centuries, hidden on Zalora. And now, a human had found it. A human. Zoria hissed, her voice a low growl that sent a chill through her attendants. Her fury was barely contained. How could a primitive species from a backwater planet like Earth have touched something so sacred? "Your Majesty," spoke General Kale, stepping forward. His reptilian features betrayed a hint of unease as he addressed the Queen. "The signal indicates the blade has been removed from its containment field. Shall we retrieve it?" Zoria turned her sharp gaze toward him, her golden cape flowing as she moved. "Retrieve it? No, General. I will not allow this insult to stand. That blade is mine by divine right, and I will see this human crushed for daring to touch it." Kale bowed his head. "The human could not possibly understand the blade's power, my Queen. They are no threat." Zoria's voice turned icy. "Do not underestimate them. The blade has chosen to awaken after centuries of silence. That alone makes the human dangerous." She stepped closer to the holographic map, her long claws tracing the glowing red dot. "Prepare my personal guard. I will oversee this mission myself." The chamber fell silent. The Queen leading an operation was unheard of, a testament to how deeply this violation had cut her pride. Kale nodded swiftly and exited the chamber, barking orders to the soldiers outside. Meanwhile, back on Zalora, Ethan scrambled through the jagged canyons beyond the dunes. The sky above was a swirl of deep oranges and purples as the twin suns set, but the beauty was lost on him. His every step was driven by the sound of the approaching alien ship. The hum of its engines grew louder, and the beam of light sweeping across the landscape was closing in. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. The sword in his hand pulsed faintly, its strange symbols shifting as if alive. He didn't understand why he had taken it, why it seemed to bond with him. But he knew one thing: it had made him a target. Ducking into a narrow cave, Ethan pressed himself against the cool stone wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He clutched the sword tightly, his knuckles white. The alien ship hovered just outside, its spotlight sweeping past the entrance of the cave. Ethan held his breath as the light passed over him, but didn't stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, cold and metallic, echoed from the ship's external speakers. "Human, we know you are there. Surrender the blade, and your death will be swift." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. Death. No thanks. He tightened his grip on the sword, glancing at the glowing symbols. If you've got any tricks, now's the time, he muttered, half hoping the blade could somehow hear him. As if in response, the sword's glow intensified. Ethan felt a sudden jolt of energy surge through his arm, and the symbols on the blade shifted into a pattern he hadn't seen before. A low hum filled the cave, growing louder by the second. Outside, the ship's spotlight stopped, and a loud metallic clank echoed as its landing gear extended. Ethan's mind raced. He had no idea what the sword was doing, but he had no intention of sticking around to find out what these aliens wanted with him. Moving deeper into the cave, he stumbled upon a narrow passage leading to an underground cavern. The faint glow of bioluminescent plants lit the way, and he hurried through, the sword guiding him with its pulsing light. Back on the Androlon mothership, Zoria prepared for her descent to Zalora. Dressed in full battle regalia, she stood at the helm of her personal warship. The blade's energy resonated with her even from orbit, and she could feel its defiance. She clenched her jaw. This human will learn what it means to cross an Androlon queen, she said to herself, her voice laced with venom. Her soldiers stood at attention, ready for the mission. They were elite hunters, trained to eliminate any threat without hesitation. Zoria's gaze burned with determination. The human had made a mockery of her, and she would not rest until the blade was back in her hands, and the human lay in pieces. Ethan, deep in the cavern, felt the ground tremble. Dust fell from the ceiling as the alien warship landed above. His fingers tightened around the hilt of the sword, the pulsing glow now steady and strong. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was clear. He wasn't giving up without a fight. The chase through the ruins. Ethan's legs burned as he sprinted through the rocky terrain, the jagged cliffs of the Zaloran desert rising like sentinels around him. The sword in his hand felt heavier with every step, its glow pulsing faintly as if mirroring his pounding heart. Behind him, the alien hunters closed in, their guttural growls and rapid footsteps echoing through the canyon. He dared a glance over his shoulder. There were 3 of them, hulking figures clad in sleek, black armor that shimmered under the faint light of Zalora's twin moons. Their helmets obscured their faces, but their movements were unnervingly precise, like predators stalking prey. One raised a clawed hand, and a bright red energy bolt zipped past Ethan, striking a boulder ahead and shattering it into a shower of sparks and debris. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, ducking behind a cluster of rocks for cover. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. The sword's glow brightened slightly, as if urging him to keep moving. "What's your deal, huh?" He whispered to the weapon, his voice laced with frustration. "You get me into this mess, and now you're just a fancy flashlight." The hunters were closing in. Ethan could hear the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground, the hiss of their breathing through their helmets. He had seconds, maybe less. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. That's when he noticed a narrow crack in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. "Better than nothing," he muttered. Clutching the sword tightly, he darted toward the crack. Another energy bolt zipped past, narrowly missing his shoulder. He slid into the narrow passage, the jagged walls scraping against his jacket. The hunters shouted in a language he didn't understand, their voices sharp and angry. One of them fired another shot, but the passage was too tight for them to follow easily. Ethan scrambled through the narrow crevice, the walls gradually widening into a sprawling underground ruin. He froze, momentarily forgetting the danger behind him. The cavern was massive, its ceiling high enough to lose sight of in the darkness. Ancient stone structures rose from the ground, their surfaces covered in the same glowing symbols etched into the sword. Faint blue light emanated from cracks in the walls, illuminating what appeared to be a central plaza. "What is this place?" Ethan whispered, his voice echoing softly. The sword pulsed in his hand, brighter now, as if answering his question. He felt a strange pull, a magnetic force drawing him toward the center of the plaza. He hesitated. The hunters were still behind him, but something about this place felt important, vital. The sound of metal boots striking stone snapped him back to reality. The hunters had followed him into the ruins, their glowing visors scanning the area. Ethan ducked behind a crumbling pillar, gripping the sword tightly. He needed a plan, and fast. One of the hunters, a towering figure with a jagged blade attached to their arm, barked an order. The other two spread out, their weapons raised. They moved with precision, their every step calculated. Ethan's mind raced. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and had no idea how to use the sword as anything other than a glorified club. "Think, Ethan," he muttered to himself. "You're not going down like this." As if in response to his thoughts, the sword's symbols shifted again, glowing brighter. A surge of energy coursed through him, and suddenly he knew what to do. It wasn't a thought, exactly. It was more like instinct. The sword was showing him the way. Ethan stepped out from behind the pillar, raising the sword. The hunters immediately locked onto him, their weapons charging. Before they could fire, Ethan swung the blade in a wide arc. A wave of bright blue energy erupted from the sword, slamming into the nearest hunter and sending them flying into a wall. The impact left a glowing scorch mark, and the hunter didn't get back up. The other two hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Ethan didn't wait. He sprinted toward the central plaza, the sword pulling him forward. The remaining hunters recovered quickly, their weapons firing rapid bursts of energy. Ethan zigzagged, the bolts narrowly missing him, and dove behind a massive stone obelisk. The sword pulsed again, and Ethan felt the strange pull intensify. He turned to see a pedestal in the center of the plaza, its surface covered in glowing runes. The sword seemed to vibrate in his hand, urging him toward it. He glanced back. The hunters were closing in, their weapons glowing ominously. Ethan made a decision. "All right, let's see what you've got." He sprinted toward the pedestal, energy bolts whizzing past him. As he reached it, the rooms flared to life, casting the entire cavern in a blinding light. The hunters stopped in their tracks, shielding their visors. Ethan placed the sword on the pedestal, and the ground trembled violently. A beam of light shot up from the pedestal, piercing the cavern ceiling and disappearing into the sky. The hunters were thrown back by the force, their weapons clattering to the ground. Ethan clung to the pedestal, the light swirling around him. When the tremors subsided, the light dimmed, and the cavern fell silent. The hunters were unconscious, their armor scorched and smoking. Ethan stepped back from the pedestal, the sword now floating above it, its glow steady and bright. He didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. The sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a key. And whatever it unlocked was far bigger than him. Ethan sighed, exhaustion washing over him. Great, just what I needed, a cosmic mystery. With no time to dwell on it, he grabbed the sword and prepared to leave the ruins. The hunters might have been down for now, but something told him this was far from over. The betrayal. Ethan stumbled into the outpost, a hidden settlement tucked away in the shadow of Zalora's jagged cliffs. The buildings were crude, made from salvaged metal and stone, their surfaces weathered by the desert winds. Dim lights flickered from windows, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the dry air. It was a haven for outcasts, smugglers, and anyone trying to escape the galaxy's watchful eyes. For Ethan, it was the perfect place to disappear, if only for a while. The sword in his pack pulsed faintly, its glow muffled but persistent. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter around him, concealing the weapon as he approached the settlement's main entrance. A pair of guards, both alien and heavily armed, eyed him warily. One of them, a stocky creature with 6 glowing eyes, raised a clawed hand to stop him. "State your business, human," the guard growled in a guttural voice. "Just passing through," Ethan said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Looking for some food, maybe a place to rest." The guards exchanged glances, then stepped aside. "Don't cause trouble," the stocky one warned. "This isn't a friendly place." Ethan nodded and stepped inside. The settlement was alive with activity despite the late hour. Merchants peddled strange wares from makeshift stalls, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. Smugglers haggled over crates of illicit goods, while mechanics worked tirelessly on battered starships. Ethan moved quickly, keeping his head down. He didn't trust anyone here, but he needed information, and maybe a way off the planet. In the corner of a dimly lit cantina, Ethan sat nursing a drink that smelled like burnt rubber, but tasted oddly sweet. His eyes scanned the room, noting the mix of species gathered around him. Some looked like hardened criminals. Others were clearly just desperate souls trying to survive. He caught snippets of conversations, none of them comforting. "The Androlons are on the move," whispered a wiry alien at a nearby table. "Heard their queen herself is hunting something down on this rock." Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what, or who, they were hunting. Before he could dwell on it, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look lost, friend." Ethan turned to see a woman standing beside his table. She was human, or at least mostly human. Her right arm was a sleek cybernetic prosthetic, and faint glowing lines traced her temple, marking her as a cyborg. Her dark hair was tied back, and her sharp eyes studied him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Name's Kayla," she said, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. "You don't look like you belong here." "Neither do you," Ethan replied cautiously. Kayla smirked. "Fair enough. But I know this place better than you do. I also know when someone's running from something." Her gaze flicked to the pack at Ethan's side. "What's in the bag?" "Just supplies." Ethan lied, his tone a little too quick. Kayla raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Look, I don't care what you're hiding. But if you're looking for a way out of here, I can help. For a price." Ethan hesitated. He didn't trust her, but he didn't have many options. The Androlons wouldn't stop hunting him, and staying on Zalora was a death sentence. "What's the price?" he asked warily. Kayla leaned in, lowering her voice. "There's a freighter leaving at dawn. It can get you off-world, no questions asked. But passage isn't cheap. 10,000 credits. Ethan's heart sank. He didn't have that kind of money. Not even close. "I don't have that much," he admitted. Kayla tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Then we'll have to get creative. You've got something valuable in that bag, don't you?" Ethan tensed. "It's not for sale." Kayla studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself, but if you change your mind, I'll be at the docks." She stood, her cybernetic arm glinting under the cantina's dim lights, and disappeared into the crowd. Hours later, Ethan sat in the corner of a dingy room he'd rented for the night. The door was locked, and he had wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. The sword lay on the bed beside him, its glow faint but steady. He stared at it, his mind racing. Kayla's offer was tempting, but something about her didn't sit right. She was too interested in his pack, too eager to help. Ethan had spent enough time on the fringes of society to know when someone had an agenda. A sudden knock at the door shattered his thoughts. "Open up, human." A gruff voice barked. "We know you're in there." Ethan's blood ran cold. He grabbed the sword, its glow intensifying, as if sensing his fear. The chair under the door handle rattled as someone tried to force their way in. "No use hiding," the voice growled. "We know you've got the blade. Hand it over, and we might let you live." Ethan's heart pounded. Betrayal. Someone had sold him out, likely Kayla. He had to move, and fast. The door burst open, the chair skidding across the floor. 3 armed figures stormed in, their weapons trained on Ethan. Without thinking, he raised the sword. A burst of energy erupted from the blade, slamming into the attackers and sending them flying backward. The room shook from the impact, and debris rained down from the ceiling. Ethan didn't wait to see if they were still alive. He bolted out of the room, the sword glowing brightly in his hand. The outpost was in chaos, its inhabitants shouting and scrambling as the commotion spread. As Ethan raced toward the docks, he spotted Kayla in the distance. She was talking to a group of armored Androlon hunters. Her expression was cold, calculating, nothing like the woman who had pretended to help him. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't have time to confront her, but he would remember her betrayal. For now, survival was all that mattered. With the sword guiding him, Ethan disappeared into the shadows, determined to find a way off Zilora, and to stay one step ahead of the Queen's wrath. The Queen's demand. Ethan had barely escaped the chaos at the outpost, his heart pounding as he piloted a stolen skiff across Zilora's rugged terrain. The small craft hummed beneath him, skimming low over the dunes, its rickety engine threatening to fail with every jolt. The glowing sword lay across his lap, its symbols shifting in a hypnotic dance. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, guiding him even now. Ahead, the horizon was dominated by a massive alien fortress, its spires rising like jagged claws into the sky. The structure radiated an ominous energy that made his skin crawl. Ethan had no choice but to head toward it. The sword's pull had grown stronger, more insistent, directing him straight into the lion's den. As the fortress loomed closer, Ethan slowed the skiff, parking it behind a ridge. He climbed out, his legs unsteady from hours of travel. The air was heavy, and the silence pressed against his ears. He knew what awaited him inside. Queen Zoria, the alien monarch who had sent her hunters after him. "You're either brave or stupid," he muttered to himself, gripping the sword tightly. Probably both. He made his way toward the fortress, sticking to the shadows. The entrance was guarded by towering Androlon warriors, their armor gleaming under the eerie green light emanating from the structure. Ethan's heart raced as he calculated his options. Fighting his way in was suicide, but the sword pulsed faintly in his hand, its glow dimming and brightening in a steady rhythm. "All right, you got me this far," he whispered to the blade. "What now?" As if in response, the sword's symbols shifted, forming a pattern that glowed brighter than before. Ethan felt a surge of energy course through him, and before he could react, his entire body shimmered and vanished from view. He looked down, his hands invisible. The sword had cloaked him. "Well, that's new," Ethan muttered, a mix of awe and disbelief in his voice. With the cloak masking him, Ethan slipped past the guards and into the fortress. The interior was even more imposing than he had imagined. Towering columns lined the walls, each inscribed with alien runes that glowed faintly. The air crackled with an energy he couldn't explain, and the distant sound of machinery echoed through the halls. The sword's pull grew stronger, guiding him through the labyrinthine corridors. Ethan moved cautiously, his steps silent, his eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Finally, he reached a massive set of doors engraved with intricate patterns. The sword pulsed in his hand, brighter now, as if urging him to enter. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the door's surface. Beyond this point was the alien queen herself, the one being who might have the answers he sought, or who might kill him on sight. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed the doors open. The throne room was a vast chamber, its walls lined with glowing runes that pulsed in rhythm with the sword. At the far end, Queen Zoria sat on an ornate throne, her golden armor gleaming under the dim light. Her piercing yellow eyes locked onto Ethan the moment he stepped inside, and a smirk played across her lips. "So," Zoria said, her voice smooth and cold, echoing through the chamber. "The human dares to enter my domain." Ethan tightened his grip on the sword, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he forced himself to stand his ground. "I didn't come here to fight," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I came to return this." He held up the sword, its glow illuminating the room. Zoria's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of surprise, and then fury. She rose from her throne, her golden cape flowing behind her as she descended the steps. Her movements were graceful yet menacing, like a predator stalking its prey. "You think to mock me, human," Zoria hissed. "You steal the blade of Rindle, Awaken its power, and now you dare to return it as if that will save you. I didn't steal it, Ethan shot back. I found it. Or maybe it found me. Either way, I don't want it. It's caused me nothing but trouble. Zoria stopped a few feet away, towering over him. Her gaze flicked to the sword, her expression unreadable. The blade does not bond with just anyone, she said, her tone softer but no less dangerous. It chose you for a reason. Tell me, human, what did it show you? Ethan hesitated. The visions he had seen. Of a grand alien city, a throne room much like this one, and the sword unleashing unimaginable power, still haunted him. I don't know what it all means, he admitted, but I saw destruction, flames, death. Is that what this thing is for? Zoria's eyes narrowed. The blade is a key, she said slowly. A key to unlocking the core of Rindal, a source of power that could restore my empire, or destroy it. Ethan's stomach sank. And you want me to help you unlock it? Zoria's lips curled into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Help me, and I may let you live, she said. Refuse, and I will take the blade by force. Ethan's mind raced. He didn't trust her, but he didn't see another way out. The sword's glow brightened, almost as if it were urging him to agree. Against his better judgment, he nodded. Fine, he said, but if you're lying to me. You are in no position to threaten me, human, Zoria interrupted, her voice icy. Follow me. The trial awaits. As she turned and began walking toward a hidden passage, Ethan swallowed his fear and followed, the sword pulsing in his hand. Whatever the trial was, it felt like it would be far worse than anything he had faced so far. The trial of unity. The hidden passage twisted and turned, its walls lined with faintly glowing runes that seemed to hum in unison with the sword in Ethan's grip. Queen Zoria led the way, her golden armor shimmering in the eerie light. Behind them, the door to the throne room sealed with a deep, resonant thud, leaving no room for retreat. Ethan's unease grew with every step. The air in the tunnel felt heavier, charged with a strange energy that seemed to press against his chest. Zoria walked with purpose, her posture regal and unyielding, but Ethan could see the tension in her movements. Whatever lay ahead, even she wasn't entirely at ease. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground chamber, its ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. The floor was a mosaic of shifting lights, forming intricate patterns that seemed alive. In the center of the room stood a towering obelisk, its surface inscribed with the same alien runes that adorned the sword. The obelisk glowed faintly, casting long, flickering shadows across the chamber. This is the core of Rindal, Zoria said, her voice reverent. The source of my empire's strength. The sword is the key to unlocking its power. Ethan's grip tightened on the hilt. And what happens if we unlock it? Another vision of destruction. Zoria turned to face him, her piercing yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. The core's power is not inherently destructive. It amplifies the will of the one who wields it. In the hands of a true leader, it can rebuild entire civilizations. But it also demands balance. Balance? Ethan echoed, his tone skeptical. What does that mean? Zoria's gaze hardened. The core requires two beings to activate it, opposites, yet equals, one to wield the sword and one to channel its power. Alone, we would both be consumed. Together, we might survive. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So this trial is about teamwork? Sounds simple enough. Zoria's lips curved into a bitter smile. You underestimate the core. It does not test only strength or cooperation. It tests resolve. Doubts, fears, and hidden truths will be laid bare. Fail, and the core will tear us apart. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Great. No pressure. Zoria gestured toward the obelisk. Place the sword in the altar at its base. The trial will begin. Ethan hesitated, the weight of the sword suddenly feeling much heavier. The visions he had seen. Fire, destruction, and the screams of the unknown flashed through his mind. Was this really worth the risk? Could he trust Zoria, a queen who had sent hunters to kill him just days ago? The sword pulsed in his hand, the glow intensifying. It seemed to urge him forward, as if it wanted this trial to happen. With a deep breath, Ithan stepped toward the obelisk. He slid the sword into a slot at the altar's base, and the chamber trembled. The moment the sword locked into place, a beam of light shot up from the obelisk, illuminating the entire chamber. The glowing patterns on the floor shifted violently, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ithan stumbled back, shielding his eyes. When the light dimmed, Ithan and Zoria stood on a floating platform, suspended in a void of swirling colors. The chamber was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of light and shadow. Ethan's heart pounded as he looked around, unsure if he was standing on solid ground or if the platform itself was an illusion. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the void. It was neither human nor alien, but something ancient, primal. Two souls stand before the core, a leader and an outcast, opposites drawn together by fate. Prove your unity or be consumed. Ethan exchanged a glance with Zoria. No pressure, right? He muttered. Zoria ignored him, her gaze fixed on the void as figures began to emerge from the swirling colors. They were translucent, their forms shifting and unstable, but their presence was unmistakable. Ethan's stomach turned as he recognized one of them, a younger version of himself, holding a broken piece of machinery and looking utterly defeated. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his throat tightening. The figure wasn't just a memory. It was alive, a manifestation of his guilt. The failure that had haunted him for years now stared him in the face. Zoria was similarly transfixed. Before her stood a towering figure, its golden armor identical to her own, but marred by cracks and scorch marks. Its face was hidden behind a featureless helmet, yet its presence radiated judgment. "Face your truths," the voice commanded, "or fall apart." Ethan's double stepped forward, its eyes filled with accusation. "You couldn't save him, could you?" it said, its voice a perfect replica of his own. "All that talk about fixing things, and when it mattered most, you failed." Ethan clenched his fists. He wanted to deny it, to shout back, but the words struck a nerve. His father's death had been an accident, but the guilt had lingered, eating away at him. On the other side of the platform, Zoria faced her own specter. The golden figure raised a shattered sword, pointing it at her. "You are unworthy of the throne," it said, its voice cold and unyielding. "Your empire crumbles because you lack the strength to lead." Zoria's jaw tightened. "I have fought to protect my people," she said through gritted teeth. "You know nothing of what I've sacrificed." The figure's voice was calm but merciless. "Sacrifice without unity is meaningless. You lead through fear, not trust. That is why you stand alone." Ethan and Zoria struggled, their own doubts threatening to overwhelm them. The void around them began to ripple, the platform cracking under their feet. Ethan turned to Zoria, desperation in his voice. "We have to do this together. That's what it wants. Unity, remember." Zoria glared at him, her pride warring with reason. "How can I trust you, human? You're a scavenger, a thief. And you're a queen who sent assassins after me." Ethan shot back. "But if we don't work together, we're both dead." The platform crumbled further, the void closing in. Ethan reached out, his hand extended toward Zoria. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she took his hand. As their hands clasped, the void exploded with light. The specters vanished, and the platform stabilized. The ancient voice echoed one final time, its tone approving. "Unity achieved. The core recognizes your bond." The swirling colors faded, and the chamber returned. The sword floated above the altar, its glow brighter than ever. Ethan and Zoria stood together, their hands still clasped. For the first time, There was no animosity between them, only a mutual understanding. Zoria released his hand, her expression unreadable. "You've proven yourself, human. But this isn't over. The core's power still awaits." Ethan nodded, the weight of the trial still heavy on his mind. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. For now, the final battle. The core chamber hummed with raw energy as the sword floated above the altar, spinning slowly. Its glow bathed the room in an ethereal light, casting long shadows on the ancient runes etched into the walls. Ethan and Queen Zoria stood side by side, their eyes fixed on the pulsing obelisk. They had passed the trial, but the real challenge lay ahead. "The core is waking," Zoria said, her voice low but tense. "Once fully active, it will release its energy. If we cannot channel it correctly, it will destroy everything in this chamber, and likely the planet." Ethan glanced at her, his knuckles white, as he gripped the hilt of the sword. "No pressure, then. Any idea what we're supposed to do?" Zoria's gaze remained locked on the core. "The power must be stabilized through the sword and the wielder. The blade will channel the energy into me, and I will contain it within the royal seal." Ethan frowned. "And what happens to me while this energy is coursing through me?" Zoria hesitated, her expression unreadable. "If your will is strong, you will survive." "Great," Ethan muttered. "Love a solid plan." Before they could begin, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the chamber. Ethan and Zoria turned to see the Androlon hunters filing in, their sleek armor glinting under the sword's glow. At their head was General Kale, his reptilian features twisted into a grim smile. "My queen," Kale said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You've gone to great lengths to retrieve the blade. But the Empire no longer needs you. The Council has decided your time is over." Zoria's golden eyes narrowed. "Traitor, you dared challenge me here, at the heart of Rindel's power." Kel's smile widened. "I do what is necessary. The core's power will be mine, and with it, I will lead the Empire to a new era." Ethan groaned. "Why is it always a coup?" Kale raised a clawed hand, and his hunters fanned out, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. Ethan stepped back, holding the sword defensively. "Oh, Zoria, do we have a plan for this?" The queen's lips curled into a fierce grin. "Yes, we fight." Cal's hunters charge, their weapons firing rapid bursts of energy. Zoria moved with deadly precision, her golden armor gleaming as she deflected incoming fire with her energy shield. Ethan, still clutching the sword, felt its power surge through him. The blade seemed to guide his movements, blocking attacks and striking with uncanny accuracy. As the battle raged, the core began to destabilize. The obelisk trembled, and cracks formed along its surface. Brilliant streams of energy shot out, lighting up the chamber. The air grew hotter, the pressure almost unbearable. "We don't have much time," Zoria shouted, cutting down one of the hunters with a swift strike. "We must activate the core now, or it will collapse." Ethan ducked behind a fallen pillar, narrowly avoiding an energy blast. "How am I supposed to focus on that when we're being shot at?" Zoria grabbed him by the arm, her eyes blazing. "The sword is bound to you. Its power flows through your will. Trust it, or we both die." Ethan took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the hilt. The blade pulsed, its glow intensifying, as if urging him forward. He stepped toward the altar, his heart pounding. Kale saw him move and snarled. "Stop him. The blade belongs to me." Two hunters lunged at Ethan, their energy weapons raised. But before they could strike, Zoria intercepted them, her sword a blur of golden light. "Go," she shouted over her shoulder. "I'll hold them off." Ethan reached the altar, the sword in his hands glowing brighter than ever. He slid it into the slot, and the entire chamber shook violently. The obelisk erupted with light, beams of energy shooting out in every direction. Ethan felt a searing pain as the power coursed through him, threatening to tear him apart. "Focus," Zoria's voice cut through the chaos. She stepped beside him, her hands raised as she began to channel the energy into the royal seal on her armor. The symbol on her chest glowed, absorbing the core's raw power. Ethan gritted his teeth, his vision blurring. The energy was overwhelming, but the sword seemed to guide him, stabilizing the flow. He could feel Zoria's presence, her strength bolstering his own. "You can do this, human," she said, her voice steady despite the strain. "You've come this far. Don't fail now." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. He focused on the sword, letting its power flow through him. The energy began to stabilize, the chaotic beams converging into a single, steady stream that poured into Zoria's seal. Kale, seeing his plan unravel, let out a roar of frustration. He charged toward the altar, his blade raised high. "I will not be denied." Ethan saw him coming but couldn't move. His entire body was locked in place, channeling the core's energy. Zoria, however, was ready. With a burst of speed, she intercepted Kale, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. "You will never lead my empire," she hissed, her golden eyes blazing. Kale snarled, but Zoria's strength was unmatched. With a final powerful strike, she disarmed him and plunged her blade into his chest. Kale's body fell lifeless to the ground, his rebellion extinguished. As the last of the core's energy flowed into Zoria's seal, the obelisk dimmed, and the chamber fell silent. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling from the strain. The sword floated back into his hand, its glow now soft and steady. Zoria stood over him, her golden armor radiating a faint light. She extended a hand, helping him to his feet. "You have done what no other could, human," she said, her tone surprisingly gentle. "The core is stabilized, and my empire is safe." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Glad I could help. Does this mean you won't kill me now?" Zoria smirked. "For now, you've earned your freedom. But remember this, our paths may cross again. And when they do, you will not find me so forgiving." Ethan nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. As he left the chamber, the sword still in his grasp, he couldn't shake the feeling that his journey with the queen and the blade was far from over.